Wide Web. Welcome to the Hangin' with Web Show on HWWS Web TV. I'm GW Pomichter. I'll be your tour guide for this incredible hangout to talk with the author of Fatal Assumptions, author James Nelson. James, how are you, man?
How are you? Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming out to hang out with us.
My pleasure.
So I'll tell you what, let's just dive right in. And as you tell me about fatal assumptions, I will make a few fatal assumptions about you. And what kind? Yes, so that's how that works. It's the internet, so there's no judgment.
Okay, right, yes, of course.
Really? Okay. So, all right, here we go.
All right.
Fatal assumptions. Where did this? What dark recess of your mind did this pop out of?
This is the fourth in a series.
Okay.
And the young man on the cover is a private detective. And the first book I wrote was called The Black Orchid Mystery, but I wrote that when he was about 55 and hoping to retire.
Uh-huh.
The next one in the series I wrote was called Unsafe Harbor, where he made enough money from The Black Orchid Mystery to retire. And this is in between other books, because I always put a book or two in between my series books.
Nice.
So then I was thinking, well, how did he become a private detective? You know, I had picked him up when he was...
The detective's origin story.
Exactly.
Often,
right.
This is a very seldom told story.
Yes, it is.
My first book, actually, is a crime noir detective origin story.
Oh, okay.
Because when you think back to the old Chandler novels and things like that, there's not an origin story. By the time you get Sam Spade, he's Sam Spade.
Exactly.
And it was a fascinating question. How does one become that archetypal detective?
Well, in that case, it was interesting because that book was called The Crimson Sky for Dying, which is kind of a rip-off title, if you're familiar.
Yes.
And this does take place in Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
So I had lived in Fort Lauderdale, and several things had happened there. So I took a license and fictionalized them, and then that's how he becomes a detective. So then after that, I had ended that book with he's walking to his office, and his real good friend sees a car pull up, and a beautiful lady walks out, and he shakes his head and he goes,
"That's not going well."
Here,
just
he
saying.
says, "Here it goes again." So I had kind of forgotten that. So 2 or 3 years later, when I was going to write this book, and I thought, well, I'll just pick up where this one ended, the Crimson Sky ended. And then I had started writing it, and I'm like, no, wait a minute. I think I ended that on a note. Mm-hmm. So I looked back, and I'm like, oh, yes, well, I'm going to have to pick up on that note. So I had to really start it over. And then,
wow.
And that's what happens there. And in this book, the lady that comes in she's the daughter of a famous spice company. She doesn't work for them. She has her own modeling agency, but she's, of course, worried that her husband is fooling around on her, the typical private eye.
You love the private eye stories, right?
So he takes the case, and she's kind of shocked because he's a young man, and this is really only his second case in this book.
I've loved those kinds of stories, and my first, I did 2 novels for my detective, and then I did what I've started is going to be a series of short stories.
Okay.
And they're his case files, and they're the short cases. They're the ones, they're not worthy of a novel, but you know every detective's got his day to day, the bread and butter cases, right?
Right.
And I wanted to have some fun with the tropes of private eyes, and that was one of them. So my very first story is The Philandering Fella. And it's the woman who comes in and she's worried that her husband's having an affair, only to find out that he's actually a nefarious criminal.
Okay.
He's not having an affair. He's
right.
committing crime.
Right.
And if she had left him alone, they'd have probably lived a very happy, successful life where he would have, had his ill-gotten gains, and they'd have gone on to be very happy together. But she was nosy, and she said, "I think he's having an affair." And instead, our detective uncovers an actual crime. And the only thing that really is relevant to the trope is the fact that it's the one sin he wasn't committing was the one that actually gets him caught, which I thought was so much fun to have, because isn't that where we all start? That you see the shape of a woman at the exterior of her PI's door, and she's there because her husband is messing around, although you never know why, because after she walks in the door, you're like, why? Why would he be messing around?
Right, exactly.
But then chaos ensues, and there's the big case that comes along.
Well, that's exactly what's happened to this book. So she's, got these suspicions. Well, he starts looking into it, and that's where the title comes from, Fatal Assumptions, because these were assumptions, and it ended up in someone getting killed, which
See,
I'm not
that's-
going to.
Again, no, that's
But,
that's
yeah.
the beauty of having these wonderful traditions in storytelling. And I think, particularly in the 20th century, the idea of the pulp detective was such an ingrained part of popular culture that it left a generation of writers thinking, how did we do it? We just fell into these stories over and over and over again. And how many, I don't know, I grew up loving classic films, so I watched Bogart play every classic
Right.
detective.
Right.
And I kept thinking to myself, they're cheesy, they're over the top, the tropes are always the same, and I'm a sucker, I fall right in. So when I started writing, I thought, well, why is it that I kept falling right in? What about these tropes makes them lovable and compelling? And it's so much fun, a generation of writers that are taking those pulp characters and saying, an origin story, give the guy a break. He had to start somewhere, right?
Sure.
He wasn't always that guy.
Exactly.
And the idea of, the assumptions that are made, the opening of every great detective novel, we just make a set of assumptions. And it's those assumptions that draw us in. But in the end, the case takes us always, almost universally, somewhere. It is the ultimate bait and switch every time. She walks in, it's find my sister, find out who my husband is
Right.
doing, and then all of a sudden, we're off the rails. We're chasing murderers, and it's crazy. So, what do you like about detective novels? What drove you into this particular genre?
Well, of course, it's a genre I like to read about. And for me, I'm a plotter. I tried unsuccessfully for over 20 years to write books as a pantster, and it never happened.
Yeah,
because-
it is. I have the utmost respect, by the way, for those people who can sit at their keyboards and somehow a linear story flows out of them.
Right.
I don't know how to do that. My mind is too many different places, and I always find that if I were to sit and just to write, I can get 2 chapters in a linear format.
Yeah.
But then my mind shoots over to chapter 8 and chapter 12, and then by the time I'm done, I'm like, I just wasted 2 hours because now I got to fill in this gap, and I have no idea where to go.
The best I ever did was I got up to 87 pages.
87 pages.
And then it all fell apart.
Because you
Yeah.
just didn't.
Yeah. But at the time, I didn't realize there were pantsters and plotters.
Yes.
Once I figured that out. And, so many books would say, well, you need to plot. But they never told you how to do it.
Yeah.
Well, I finally found one book that actually showed me how to plot, and it was called The Marshall Plan for Novel Writing.
Oh, wow.
And I read that 12 years ago, and I've put out a book ever since.
That's
one
fantastic.
book a year ever since. So
That is awesome.
But back to your question. So the reason I like detectives is you have to plot. I have to plot because
Yeah.
I always put 2 storylines, 2 completely different, or 3 completely different storylines together. And I weave them, because the Marshall Plan showed me how, but I weave them together. And if you read reviews on my books, that's what people like about it. They're like, where is this going? Because there's this plot line, the major storyline, and then there's a subplot. And then there's usually
Well, it's
another
and
one.
it really is.
They fit together.
It's an important part, I think, of a good detective novel. And I don't pretend to write good detective novels. I do okay. But I think it's a pivotal part of a good detective novel is to have a secondary and maybe a tertiary storyline, because a linear plot for a detective novel becomes predictable, and not on purpose. It's not like you're ever giving them anything on purpose. It's just that when you're left following a single thread, it doesn't take long for you to figure out where that thread's going to unravel. And there are rules to storytelling and to making a good story compelling.
Right.
And if anybody who's done a lot of reading or watching television or watching good movies, they've got the rules sort of inherently memorized. So
Well,
if you tell a single thread,
it's not realistic.
they will just find
Right.
they just find that, and they cut right there,
Right.
and they're boom, and they're at the end. Whereas a couple of different threads leading in, and now right about the time they think they can predict it, we're going to go over here now. And then when you think you've got this predicted, we're going to go over here now. And as we come back together toward the nexus, that's where I think readers now find you've just given me 8 chapters of your life. You're going to give me the next 3. I know you are, because you've already committed the time.
Well, readers, I mean, everybody watches TV, and they're so used to watching episodic TV, and there's never one single storyline in any show that you
it's
watch.
hard.
It goes from
is.
here to here to here to here.
Yeah.
And I think people expect that now in their novels. So, maybe this wasn't the case 40 or 50 years ago, but I think it's really changing.
It really
now.
is, and I think especially now that long format storytelling has worked its way into popular culture now. So, when you think of these massive, blockbuster franchises, they've taken a page out of novel writing, and they've made our audience that much more sophisticated, because when you go home, what used to be episodic television, there was, I don't ever remember, did Lucy and Desi ever actually get married on film? I don't remember, because every episode was different. Episodic TV changed now into things like Game of Thrones, where now we're watching as serial television, and serial filmmaking is happening. And in serials, they have to follow our rules. And in doing so visually, they've created an audience that is far more sophisticated.
Right.
It is, you go back and watch those old movies we grew up on and loved so much. They're so two-dimensional, and you think to yourself, how did I ever get behind this guy?
I can't believe you said
I
that,
can't-
because I'll watch a movie that I thought was so fantastic, and like from the 40s even, and then like,
I
it's
watch-
just someone wrote this, and
Every
someone
year,
approved this.
every
It's just
year
like-
I watch, because it's one of the great American films. It really, truly is. But as a person who does video and filming and things, when I watch it with different eyes, and as a storyteller,
Right.
I watch it with different eyes. I go back and watch Bilgart's classic, The Maltese Falcon,
Oh, right.
which is based on, by the way, a brilliant book.
Right.
But on film, the limitations of time, the time constraints of a film, especially in the 30s, combined with the lack of a visual tapestry that you can have, because remember that they shoot everything in grayscale in the 1930s. So when you combine those elements, what you get is this very flat, two-dimensional drama. It requires a Bogart to bring this character to life.
Film
Otherwise,
noir.
you couldn't buy it. It requires that style.
Right.
Because as a story, there are just points along the way where you think, in my book, this wouldn't work.
Right.
And I know that in the original Maltese Falcon book, that's not the way they played it, because it wouldn't work. But on film back then, in a two-dimensional thing, now if we were to try to remake that today, lacking a Bogart, as it were,
Right.
The audience would just laugh.
Yeah,
out
they're
loud.
too sophisticated.
They are. They're hard. And they read too much, and they watch too many movies, and they watch too much. We have a lot of leisure time, apparently. I just thought about that as I said the sentence. I was like, wait a minute. They read too much. They watch too much. They do a lot of things. When do you people work? I know when I watch TV for a living, so it's wonderful. I get to read books and watch TV and do all that stuff. So now this is one series. This is your detective series.
Right.
But you've got a lot of other things, a lot of other frying pans on the fire.
Yeah.
So what do you got going on?
Well, right now I'm writing a standalone, and it's another mystery. It's actually taking place in my hometown, and I've written several books that have taken. I'm from northern Michigan, and I've written a series.
We're sorry.
Oh no. It's been a long time.
We're only
since
9
I
months
lived
out of
up
the year.
there.
We're sorry.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But so I skirted around the area, but I never really wrote a book right from
In
my
town.
hometown. Right.
Okay.
But this time I'm taking the plunge, and I'll probably never be allowed to visit there again. But
Yeah, the coffee shop will have
yeah.
a wanted poster or something. Yeah, they do that.
So I'm taking a chance, but
Yeah,
it's
I
a
like-
lot of fun.
My favorite thing is I wait till my children make me mad, and then I write a character and kill them off.
Oh, right.
It's just punishment around the house. I
Exactly.
just look and say, look, I just killed you. Have a nice day. So you got a standalone, just another
Yeah,
mystery novel
but it's
coming?
just started, so it'll be about 8 months before that one's out.
Outstanding. And you do about one book a year.
Yeah, about one book a
I
year.
like that. If you guys are out there and you're starting out in writing, you're going to see people who write at all different paces and all different things.
Right.
And I know writers who can do, what I call formula writing. If you're a romance novelist and that's what you do, you're in your genre, you probably do 3 or 4 books a year. If you are, if you're a mystery writer and you're a massive plotter, then it takes more time.
Right.
For one, every thread you create, you have to pull on, see if it unravels, because you have to know if your reader is going to catch you.
Yeah, I'll start out my books, mysteries, I'll start it with 48 scene sheets, and then I go from there, and I know where to interweave my 2 storylines or 3 storylines.
Very nice.
So I'll plot for at least 6
Now,
weeks.
Do you plot out from, and I know your mind is probably all over the place, but when you're sitting down, do you plot out in a linear fashion? Do you take where your story points are coming together, like a nexus point, and work back from there? Or do you have a resolution that you work from?
I'll usually know who the killer is and who gets murdered before I start.
So you've got your resolution.
Yeah. So then it's a lot easier to place your red herrings.
Yes.
Things of that nature. But yeah, I'll know that before I start.
What is, for you, knowing I know the victim and I know the bad guy. With that knowledge, for you, what is the biggest challenge in taking that knowledge and working it into a narrative? What's the biggest what if question for you? You already know who done it.
Right. Well, okay. You know who done it, but you don't know how they did it and how it was a mystery. Mm-hmm. So, you start off with a very broad brush, and then you keep getting more detailed and more detailed and more detailed. And then sometimes you'll know what happened, but you can't explain it. You really have to think about it. And how come nobody figured this out? And there's some, but even though I plot for quite very consistently, every now and then there'll be a surprise character that is not in any place in my book.
None of your notes. It's like,
but it'll pop out, and it's not in every book. But when that happens, that's really
well, I think
exciting.
it's a special moment for a writer too, because
Yeah.
Most character development, you keeping track of your character's development
Right.
all along the way to make sure you're hitting certain key
Mm-hmm.
notes.
Right.
But every once in a while, I want to throw a waitress into the diner who's got a few lines just to make me feel real. And then it turns out that the more you look at this character, the more and now by the time you do it, it's a tiny part, but it's the example. I would tell people, if you watch movies, it's the example of that one character actress that stole the show.
Right.
Because in your imagination, that's what happened. You created this character just as an interactive tool, and she became a character.
Well, if anybody reads books on writing, they always have the line in there where I was typing away and doing what my character was doing, and then all of a sudden they started doing their own thing, and I could hardly keep up, and I was so surprised. And before I actually started writing, when I was reading books on writing, I'm like, impossible. You're writing the book, but of course that's not impossible.
No,
and that does take
I
off.
don't know how I don't know how James' imagination works. In my mind, whenever I'm writing, if I set myself at a pace, so okay, here's my outline, and here's where I want to write today. I'll start the scene, I'll start the chapter, and then the next 2 chapters or so are kind of on a loop, like I'm watching a movie in my brain. Mm-hmm. And I, as the author, all I'm trying to do is find the details in each frame that I want to describe. But I'm watching it over and over and over again. And every once in a while, something happens on screen that it's coming from my brain, but I didn't realize that it was important.
Well, a friend gave me a book just recently by John Cleese, and it was about imagination and creativity. And what he said, the whole gist of the book was that your subconscious is going to help you out. And every time I've reached that stage where I'm stuck, I know what has to happen, but I really don't know how to make it happen. I'll wake up at 4:30, 5:30 in the morning, and it'll be there. And I won't go to bed thinking about it. I don't think about it at all. But the answer will come. I mean, it happens all the time.
And with a story, again, as you imagine a story, it writes itself in your head, and everything you know, and everything you've read, and everything that you are made up of seeps into it. Mm-hmm. And so again, in those scenes, every once in a while, there'll be 5 frames in your scene that you didn't actually know you put there.
Yes.
They're just there.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, I better write those down.
Right.
So that's awesome. Guys, we've been hanging out with author James Nelson, the author of Fatal Assumptions and many other things. We're going to put a link down below so that you can find James and all of his work on Amazon and all through the digital atmosphere that's out there, the place where you're watching this right now. I don't know where that is. But if I did, I would send you James's book. But instead, I'm going to send you to James's book, because that's what, see what we just did there? Okay, good deal. Stay tuned in, guys. Stay logged on and see who we're hanging with next.